In 1856, a doctor in New York named James Rushmore Wood admitted a 16-year-old girl named Cornelia to Bellevue Hospital. Her jaw had rotted away. The exposed bone was dead, spongy, oozing. And when he turned off the lights in the room, the bone glowed, a faint, sickly green right there under her skin. Cornelia hadn't been poisoned by an enemy. She hadn't touched anything exotic or forbidden. She got a job, a normal, respectable, working-class job, packing boxes 8 hours a day for 2.5 years. And that job was slowly, silently dissolving her face from the inside. Today, we're talking about the single most boring object in your kitchen drawer, a tiny stick of wood with a colored blob on the end. You've probably lit thousands of them without a second thought. But that little stick has a body count. It launched an industrial disease so grotesque, doctors nicknamed it after a monster. It sparked one of the most important labor strikes in history. And it is, quite literally, bottled lightning that took humanity 6,000 years to figure out how to carry in a pocket. This is the strange, occasionally glowing, and surprisingly bloody history of the match. To understand why this mattered so much, you have to understand just how hard it used to be to simply have fire. For almost the entirety of human history, you didn't start a fire, not really, you kept one alive. Households maintained a single hearth, sometimes for years, because striking a new flame from scratch, using flint and steel or spinning a stick against dry wood, took skill, patience, and a lot of failed attempts. If your fire went out overnight and it was raining, that could genuinely ruin your week. The first real shortcut we know of shows up in China sometime around the 6th century during a period of war and sieges. Historical accounts describe courtwomen, besieged and cut off from open flame, coating thin sticks of pine wood in sulfur. Sulfur ignites at a much lower temperature than wood, so touching one of these sticks to even a tiny ember would instantly burst it into flame. By the 1300s, Chinese records describe something they called fire inch sticks, small sulfur-tipped splints sold in markets for exactly this purpose. They weren't self-igniting, you still needed an existing spark, but they were the first tool built purely to move fire from one place to another, cheaply and fast. For the next 400 years or so, that's about as good as it got. Then, in the late 1600s, an alchemist in Germany accidentally invented the ingredient that would eventually make an actual self-igniting match possible. And I do mean accidentally, because the ingredient came from a bucket of stale human urine. Hennig Brand wasn't trying to invent anything useful. Like a lot of alchemists at the time, he was trying to turn base materials into gold. He'd become convinced, for reasons that made sense to basically nobody but him, that the golden color of urine meant it secretly contained gold. So he collected an enormous quantity of it, let it sit and ferment, boiled it down to a thick paste, and heated that paste until it produced strange white vapors. It wasn't gold, but when he condensed those vapors, he ended up holding a waxy white substance that glowed faintly in the dark and burst into flame on contact with air. He'd just isolated phosphorus, one of the most reactive elements on the periodic table, discovered by boiling down roughly 50 buckets of pee. Modern chemistry owes an embarrassing bet to that bucket. Other scientists took notice. In 1680, Robert Boyle refined the process and found that a wood splinter coated in sulfur would burst into flame if drawn across a strip of paper coated in phosphorus. It worked, technically. It was also wildly impractical, since phosphorus at the time was rare, unstable, and absurdly expensive to produce. For over a century after that, inventors kept circling the same basic problem. They had the chemistry, they just couldn't make it safe, cheap, and portable all at the same time. Amusingly, in 1805, a French chemist named Jean Chancel came up with a version that technically worked, a match tipped with a mix of sugar, sulfur, and potassium chlorate, which you lit by dipping it in a small bottle of concentrated sulfuric acid. Picture that for a second. To light a candle, you carried around a little glass vial of acid. It was expensive, it was dangerous, and unsurprisingly, it never really caught on with the general public. The real breakthrough, the one that actually changed daily life, happened by accident in 1826 in a small pharmacy in Stockton-on-Tees, England. John Walker was a pharmacist experimenting with chemical mixtures, trying to develop something for use in guns. While mixing his ingredients, he scraped the wooden stick he was using against the floor of his fireplace to clean it off. It caught fire, immediately, violently, unexpectedly. Walker realized what he was looking at. He refined the formula into a paste of antimony sulfide, potassium chlorate, and gum, coated cardboard strips with it, and started selling what he called friction lights out of his shop in the spring of 1827. Here's the part that should sting a little. Colleagues, including the famous scientist Michael Faraday, urged Walker to patent his invention. He didn't bother. Apparently, he just didn't think it was significant enough to protect. Amusingly, within a few years, other chemists, most notably a London druggist named Samuel Jones, copied the formula almost exactly, rebranded it under the far more dramatic name Lucifer's, and made a fortune Walker never saw a penny of. Walker's matches worked, but they had problems. The burning sulfur head sometimes detached mid-strike and dropped onto whatever was underneath it, occasionally setting fire to carpets, tablecloths, and clothing. So, in 1830, a French chemistry student named Charles Sarria decided to improve the formula. He swapped out the antimony sulfide for a small amount of white phosphorus. And it worked beautifully. Sarria's matches lit more reliably with less smell on almost any rough surface. Within a couple of decades, they had become the dominant match sold across Europe and America, with factories producing them by the billions. And this is where the story turns genuinely dark. White phosphorus is extremely effective at starting fires. It is also extremely toxic, and the people who suffered for that weren't the customers striking the matches at home. It was the workers, overwhelmingly poor women and children, standing over open vats of the stuff for 12 or 14 hours a day, breathing in its fumes. Doctors started documenting a horrifying new condition in the 1840s. It began quietly, with a toothache and swollen gums, then abscesses. Then the jawbone itself would start to die, turning porous and worm-eaten, separating from the healthy bone around it. And in the dark, the dying bone glowed a faint greenish white. They called it phossy jaw. Roughly 1 in 5 cases ended in death, usually from the infection spreading through the body. Survival often meant a surgeon sawing away the rotted portion of your jaw, sometimes the entire lower half of your face, without anesthetic. Nobody could figure out at first why the disease targeted the jaw specifically, of all places in the body. The answer turned out to be bone biology. Your skeleton isn't static, it's constantly being broken down and rebuilt by 2 types of cells: osteoclasts, which dissolve old bone, and osteoblasts, which lay down new bone. Your jaw, thanks to the mechanical stress of chewing and the dense blood supply around your teeth, remodels itself faster than almost any other bone in your body. Inhaled phosphorus vapor gets absorbed into that fast-cycling bone tissue, poisons the cells responsible for repairing it, and then, when a tooth is pulled or a gum is nicked, exposes dead, phosphorus-soaked bone to infection with no way to heal. By the 1880s, the industry making these matches was booming, and nowhere more than at the Bryant and May factory in London. Around 1,400 women and girls worked there, some as young as 13, for brutal hours and painfully low wages, while shareholders collected dividends of over 20%. In the summer of 1888, a social activist named Annie Besant published an article exposing the conditions inside the factory: the fines, the long hours, the ever-present risk of phossy jaw. Management demanded the workers sign a statement denying it. They refused. Management responded by firing whoever they suspected of talking. The next day, roughly 1,400 women walked out. The strike drew huge public support and national press coverage, and within about 2 weeks, Bryant and May paved. They rehired the fired workers, scrapped the unfair fine system, and the strikers formed one of the first large labor unions led by women in British history. It's remembered as one of the pivotal moments of the early labor movement, but it's worth being honest about something. The strike won better pay and fairer treatment almost immediately. It did not, on its own, end the use of white phosphorus. That took another 2 decades. Change finally came through a mix of international pressure and one genuinely surprising act of corporate generosity. In 1906, several European nations signed an agreement in Switzerland called the Bern Convention, banning the manufacture, import, and sale of white phosphorus matches outright. Meanwhile, over in America, a company called Diamond Match had, in 1910, patented a non-toxic alternative using a compound called phosphorus sesmar sulfide, safe enough that it didn't poison the people making it. President William Howard Taft personally asked the company to release that patent for the good of the public, and in 1911 they actually did it. They gave the formula away for free to every competitor in the country. Congress followed up by taxing white phosphorus matches so heavily that within a couple of years nobody could afford to make them anymore. Phossy jaw, a disease that had disfigured and killed matchworkers for nearly 80 years, essentially disappeared within a decade. There's an even cleaner solution that had actually existed the entire time, sitting mostly ignored. Back in 1844, a Swedish chemist named Gustav Erik Posch had figured out how to split the dangerous chemistry in half. Instead of packing all the reactive ingredients into the match head itself, he put the oxidizer in the head and moved the red phosphorus, a much safer, more stable form of the element, onto a separate striking strip on the side of the box. Neither half could ignite on its own. Only the friction of rubbing them together, head against strip, released enough heat to set off the reaction. It was, quietly, one of the smartest safety redesigns in industrial history, and it's still exactly how the box of safety matches in your kitchen drawer works today. So the next time you strike a match, here's what's actually happening in that half second. The friction heats the red phosphorus on the strip just enough to convert a tiny amount of it back into unstable white phosphorus, which instantly ignites. That tiny flame sets off the potassium chlorate and sulfur packed into the match head, which burns hot enough to catch the wood itself. 3 separate, carefully engineered chemical failures stacked on top of each other in exactly the right order, all so you can light a candle without thinking about it for even a second. It's strange to think about, but this small, cheap, disposable object was genuinely one of the last major technologies to arrive before the modern era. Electric light, indoor plumbing, antibiotics, all of it came after the humble match had already been sitting in nearly every home in the industrialized world for decades. For a huge stretch of the 19th century, it was matches, more than almost anything else, that quietly extended the useful hours of the working day, lit the lamps, started the stoves, and let ordinary people control fire the instant they needed it, without ceremony, without effort, and eventually without poisoning themselves to do it. It's a strange kind of monument when you think about it. Nobody erects a statue to the match. It doesn't sit behind glass in a museum. It gets struck once and thrown away. But somewhere in the walls of your kitchen drawer is the ghost of a 6th century Chinese siege, a bucket of fermented urine, a pharmacist too modest to patent his own invention, and roughly 1,400 women who refused to keep quiet about what their jobs were doing to their bodies. All of that so you can light a candle without a second thought. If you liked this one, we've actually covered 2 other everyday objects with disturbingly violent hidden histories: the real story of soap and the strange, occasionally murderous history of the mirror. Go check those out next.